Petersburg, which I understand is somewhere around 1963. What do you envision the conditions in the city and the environment in the city to have been at that time?
Mr. Fronto, thank you so very much. I came to Petersburg in April of 1963 as a minister of Zion Baptist Church, and the movement was already in progress. That had already been, some things had already been put in place and some things had already been done in terms of the library, and you know the story behind the library, and the lunch counter. Some sit-ins had taken place and so forth. So when I came to Petersburg, the time was ripe with excitement, seeing some possibilities of some new days and some possibilities of some progress, and people were ready for leadership, and leadership was being provided. They've been blessed with leadership, but the question was, how do we do this? What else do we need to do? Where do we go from here? We've done some things. What's next? As I began to look at that, it was not long before, a few months before, there was the March on Washington, and I was involved in getting the transportation for that. And that helped to kind of sparkle the idea, because so many people had been familiar with Martin Luther King and the whole movement, and the Petersburg Improvement Association had already been in place. And that kind of added fuel to the fire, to saying, we can't stop here, we must keep going. And that was the impetus that kind of helped to crystallize what we needed to do. And one component that we needed was to be sure that the schools and the political arena were taken care of, and also we had to be very, very sure that we had to do something for housing. Those were the ideas.
In relationship to what you just indicated, do you recall what may have taken place in reference to moving the city in the direction that you have at least alluded to?
Well, there were several groups already in place. There were several concerned citizens groups. Later on, there became a group called PBEC, the Petersburg Voter Education Committee for Voting and Politics, as far as that's concerned. But there was some organizations. There was still some boycotts in Petersburg, and one of the big things was to how can we marshal the forces and unify those forces so that we could move together. And since nobody had a complete blueprint for how this should be done, some of what we had to do was kind of trial and error. We wanted to be sure we got involved in jobs, and of course Breadbasket, Operation Breadbasket that Martin Luther King had started along with Jesse Jackson. We had to tie into that. How could we find jobs in Petersburg? How could we get the schools integrated in Petersburg? How could we get a place at the table in the political arena in Petersburg? So we began to kind of try out with we had some boycotts. We had some that were very successful. We had a boycott on the city that was successful. Theaters and lunch counters and all, which did some of that. But the idea was consolidating and unifying persons so that we could move forward together.
What do you think the impact of what you described was on the community in the city at that time?
Well, it was very positive because people accepted the leadership. They were very enthusiastic. They were very cooperative. The entire community, churches, organizations, individuals, marshaled their forces together. We had several mass meetings. That was one of our means of communication, and a very successful means of communication, because whenever issues were at hand, we got the people together at a church or in some place, and we talked about the issues, and people had an opportunity to air what they thought. And so it was very, very necessary for us to keep in contact with our base, and that mass meeting became the medium whereby we kept communication, and we would plan our strategies. We had smaller groups that would implement those strategies, and we reported back to people from time to time, and that kept the unity flowing because people needed to be on board to know what was doing so we could solicit their cooperation and their input.
During that period of time, do you think that there was a need, and did we implement the need in terms of getting more involved in the political scene in Petersburg? Very
definitely, because we realized that some of the steps that needed to be taken had to be taken politically. So there was beginning, I remember we had a council on race relations to come up one time. We developed that, and that was hopefully a step that started us in the direction. There were some political overtures that fell out of that, but at least it got started. And then Mr. Joe Owens, and I know his name has been called many times, he made himself available as a candidate for city council. And he was able, because of some things happened, he was able to get a seat on city council. And then we began to realize that we were at the beginning of some political power that we hadn't utilized before, not in the same. So that was in 64, I believe it was. Mr. Owens was elected city council. And then there came Mr. Fauntleroy, yourself, Mr. Fauntleroy, and you made yourself available as a candidate for city council, and the city mobilized behind you and got you elected to city council. And that was a real show of power, and for the first time, well, maybe for the first time, the powers that be began to see that there was very definitely some clout in the community, because we had elected you as a member of the city council along with Mr. Owen. And so this was, this helped us to get at the table where some things that were necessary could be done, and one of them that was most outstanding, many of them were done, but one was housing, because there were some people, even in positions where they should have known better, who claimed that Petersburg didn't need any housing. And the truth of the matter, that Petersburg was one of the blighted cities on the Eastern Seaboard. And you, Mr. Fauntleroy, was one who introduced the legislation that brought about the beginning of the Petersburg Redevelopment and Housing Authority. And as a result of that, the high-rise came, and the Gill Street area was cleaned up. All of that because of politics, because you were there and you could speak on behalf of your clientele. And that was very important. Getting a foot in the door politically was very, very important, along with other things, but that was very important.
With that in mind, do you think the community itself was ready to get involved in those kinds of activities, and did they support it?
They supported it, they got involved, and they made themselves available to participate on the various commissions as they were being appointed and being suggested. Before that time, there were very few places that appointed blacks to a position. But because we were at the table, people were ready, and people offered themselves to become members of various boards that were available, and they showed by that they were not only ready, but they were prepared to take their places in the development of the entire city. So they were very cooperative, very helpful, and very available and very supportive.
Do you recall whether or not our religious community was involved in any of that?
It was very definitely so, because, as I said, all facets of the community, the business people in the community, the church leaders and the churches were involved, and the grassroots were involved, the students were involved in it. So all of that worked together. And some of the example is that some of the leadership came from pastors. There was Y.T. Walker, legendary Y.T. Walker. There was Reverend Dr. Milton Reed and Reverend Dr. Williams, R.G. Williams at the various churches. And then the Clergy Association and the Baptist Ministers Conference all were involved. Churches were primarily the places where meeting took place. They gave their support. The members of the churches gave their support. And of course, the movement, as you well know, the movement started at the church. And it was at Zion Church in 1960 when there was some arrests made, because that was Petersburg was coming together to organize. And it had the blessings of, the leadership of, and the support of the church, the preachers, and the church members, and other facets of the community as well. Cooperation was a key word, and people did really work together, and that was the genius that kept this thing going and made the success.
I realize that the library situation, in terms of integrating the library, started prior to your arrival in the city of Petersburg, but do you think that that particular issue had anything to do with our becoming really involved in the whole civil rights era?
Very important. You may call it somewhat of a kind of a first step. And you flex your muscles and see the results, and you learn some things, and you try some strategies and found out that they work pretty well. And that kind of moved you to the next stage. So it was the beginning of a movement, a progressive movement. So it went from the library, it went to the lunch counters, It went to the boycotts of various facilities in the city. And as we picked the momentum, we found that we could do more and more things. So it was kind of a building blocks kind of situation. The library was very fundamental in getting it started because people realized that they could do, and they realized they had the ability to do. And then, of course, while this was going on, the movement throughout the South and throughout the nation, through the NAACP and through SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, all of that helped to inspire people locally because the leadership was coming, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, coming from churches, and the people said, look, if they can do it in Montgomery, we can do it in Petersburg. And so the movement outside of the area helped to fan the fires and the fuel for here. So, but the school, the lunch counters, the library was probably, you know better than I do, it was probably the beginning, but it was certainly a helpful part of it.
How do you think the community, if you will, accepted this change that was beginning to take place, and how were they involved, or were they readily involved? And I'm talking about basically the citizenry in the city of Petersburg.
Well, change comes slowly. Some persons are kind of area of change taking place. But in Petersburg, I saw and sensed a readiness. It was not the total city, because it never is a total city. There were some persons who didn't want to, quote, rock the boat, let things stay where they are. But there were enough people who were aware and conscious to carry this on. And one of the important elements was that there were a lot of young people involved. Students were involved, both in the high school here and in the local situation, and some from the University of Virginia State and so forth. So it was a young people movement too, and the older persons who didn't always quite see it didn't stand in the way of it happening. Some stood on the sideline and some were very much involved. They may have had some misgivings somewhere along the line, but they were not afraid to say, look, I've been all the time, it has not happened. Maybe this is an opportunity for it to happen, so I'm not going to block it. So they were not blocking it. Some of it's a second question sometimes. But because of the youthful fervor that came about, it was enough to say that we had a pretty good support, well, in fact, excellent support, and very heavy involvement throughout the city.
The Brown versus the Board of Education, of course, had taken place several years before the period that we're really talking about, and Petersburg really still hadn't done anything in terms of following that mandate from the Supreme Court. What's your opinion in reference to the impact of that within the city of Petersburg at that time?
Well, that was another phase of the development. All it was a part of one big effort. But that was a part of it because there were parents, and your family was involved in that, the John Cole family and Alice Cole family, and others who were bold enough to say, my children will be involved. The children wanted to be involved, and they put themselves on the line to register for integration and so forth, as it was happening in some other places as well in Virginia. We had the Farmville situation in schools closing in Farmville and Warren County, I believe, another situation. But that was also a part of the impetus. So the parents of those pioneering children are to be commended, along with the children themselves, who said they put themselves physically, personally, in the place to say, look, I am going to do this. We saw it happening elsewhere, but people in Petersburg had the same courage and the same determination and the same drive. And so those people who started out, those pioneers, those brave, daring ones, inspired others. So say, now, if they can do that, we can at least be supportive. They're into this thing. They're helping all of us. So it was that kind of effect on the community that those people were appreciated because of the daring steps that they were willing to take, and that was very important to keep the movement going, because it was in many facets. Schools was one of it, political was one of it, housing was one of it, economic, and just say getting jobs. During that time, we were able to locate jobs in places in which blacks had not worked before. We saw them coming up as cashiers in some places, We saw them being placed in certain strategic positions that they hadn't been in before. And that was a part. So economic, political, housing, educational, all of those facets working together, bringing about, and the fearlessness and the courage that people showed, and the leadership, the creative leadership that was shown throughout this. It was really a marvelous thing taking place right in dear old Petersburg, Virginia.
When you assumed the pastorship of Zion Baptist Church, as I remember, what was Petersburg General Hospital at that time really was still segregated.
Right.
And there was a location within the hospital, of course, where
Second floor, yeah.
blacks or African Americans were sent to, if you will, in terms of being cared for. Sometime after that, of course, you became quite involved with the hospital authority. What do you think the atmosphere was within the hospital in reference to bringing about that kind of change, and what did you see when you became directly involved as far as the authority is concerned?
Well, the hospital, like most of the other facets in Petersburg, was a little slow to move. As you indicated, there was an area like the second floor that was designated, quote, for blacks, with the exception, I think maternity may have been a little bit different, maternity ward. But other than that, the blacks were on the second floor. When I went up to visit people from my church in the community, all I had to do was go to the second floor for the most part, and have go to the third or the fourth. That's where they were. And there was some dissatisfaction in that, of course, and the same fervor that was making people look at education in a different way was also making them look at the hospital in a different way, and especially, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was a Hill Burden Fund, if I'm correct, Hill Burden Fund that helped to finance the hospital. It made some funds available to the hospital. That was government money, and government money comes from taxes, and taxes comes from everybody. So therefore, the Hill Burden Fund was money coming from blacks as well. So how could you use black money to segregate blacks in the facility? That was in the background of people's thinking. So people were ready to push on to see how that could eliminate. I remember one instance is, let me call the name of Milton Reed, Dr. Milton Reed, went up to the hospital because they couldn't find a certain room for a certain person, and he went around in his robe, in his pulpit robe, found a space that was vacant. It wasn't on the designated black area, but it was vacant. It was a vacant. And he said, well, here's a room right here. Why can't you go right there? And of course, the reason was that the person was black and not supposed to be in that part of the hospital. That became news, and that showed the absurdity of such movement. Now, that took place in the 60, 65, 66, along in that category. And then, of course, we were able to get some persons on the hospital authority. James Jemison, James Duval, remember those, on the hospital authority, and they had a seat on it. At least they were on the inside. Later on, there were some other blacks added. I went on the hospital authority in 1988. So some of that, the hospital had been integrated by that time, 88. But there were still pockets of resistance and pockets of subtle kind of situations. We could address some of them we could not address, but overall, we had about 6 members at one time. Out of the 15-member authority, we had about 6 members who were black. And we didn't have a voting block of any kind. We tried to work with the authority. We tried to promote our ideas and promote the ideas, and they were pretty well accepted. I believe Jemison became a chairman of the hospital authority at one time. Tom Bridge was the chairman of the hospital authority at one time. I was the chairman of the hospital at one time. Grady Powell was the chairman of the hospital authority at one time. And as you became, and vice chairman before that time, so that gave you a chance to have some direct impact. It wasn't headline grabbing. It wasn't anything to grab the headlines. But there were some things you could do because you were put in certain positions. And that happened. And I think that I saw in the paper today, and I haven't finished reading the paper today, that the Cameron Fund has just distributed $1 million+ to various kind of agencies in Petersburg. That money came because the hospital was sold, and the agencies that are receiving that money are very, very happy that this money is available. This is not the corpus of the money. This is the interest that comes on the money that came from the sale of the hospital. And you know, Petersburg, and I won't go into that story, but had a lot of opposition to this thing and so forth. But now everybody's happy to receive, and there are so many other benefits I won't go into. But that's just one idea of a forward movement that met some resistance, considerable resistance from several people. But now that it has been done, and a new hospital is developing over there in Petersburg, and from that, other economic initiatives are being taken. Everybody says, "Oh, isn't this a wonderful thing?" Couldn't quite see that 10 years ago. But the hospital has played a good part, and it has been very helpful. Now in the next 2 years from our sitting here this afternoon, we'll be into a state-of-the-art, brand new hospital in the city of Petersburg. I'd be proud of that. Yes, we are.
Well, that obviously is a real plus. There's no question about that. And I would think, and just maybe your comment on this, but I would think that that particular situation would certainly generate some employment for the city of Petersburg in terms of a new hospital. As I understand it, there's a rehabilitation hospital that has come about as a result of that, and I'm sure other businesses
Another
in that
clinic facility is being built down there now, and of course there are other economic on Crater Road, on South Crater Road that's coming. So there will be job fallouts directly from the hospital. I mean, when I say fallout, I mean employment opportunities. For example, in the construction itself, just the mere people who are employed to do the construction, that's jobs. So there will be other jobs available to people, but not only that, there will be, should I say, ancillary jobs coming up in other areas as a result of the hospital having done what it has done. There will be other economic initiatives taken that will also provide jobs. So the hospital divided directly, and then the impetus that the hospital has on promoting and encouraging other economic development will be jobs too. So it will be kind of a first line, and then those that will come in the wake of that.
Speaking about employment in the city of Petersburg, and in the past we have had some problems in terms of, and probably still have some problems in terms of fair employment, if you will. But what's your opinion in reference to the status of employment as far as blacks are concerned in this city as it relates to the types of jobs that people can really benefit from?
Well, you look at the job market in Petersburg, and you look at potential workers. Most industry would want to be established where there are an abundance of potential workers. We have to work with our schools because they're basic. They're very basic. They're basic in equipping people to be able to do things. All right. So if the job pool, if the available person to work is not so strong, then that will not be encouraging for people, industry to locate here. We have to take a good look at the workforce to be sure that there's a quality workforce and people who will have good work ethics. That's very important. Now, and of course, there has been in the past sometimes discriminatory practices in job opportunities. We know that. Some of it has been overcome. But we have some work to do to be sure that we have some a qualified pool of potential workers who have a good work ethic.